بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله ما بعد فإن أحسن الكلام كلام الله وخير الهدى هدى محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وإن شر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. So we started on the statement of Imam al-Tahawi, وَاللَّهُ يَغْضَبُ يَرْضَى لَا كَأَحَدٍ مِنَ الْوَرَى وَاللَّهُ يَغْضَبُ وَيَرْضَى لَا كَأَحَدٍ مِنَ الْوَرَى, which means that Allah becomes angry and becomes pleased, but not like anyone from the creation. And we looked at the brief commentary of Sheikh Zayd al-Madkhali in the previous lesson, rahimahullah, and we started with the comments of Sheikh Salih al-Sheikh. And basically the point that was made in the last lesson was that these attributes which are connected to Allah's will and Allah's choice, Allah's mashi'ah, Allah's ikhtiyar, and that there are some attributes which Allah Azza wa Jal, in fact that's something that we're going to discuss in today's lesson, but we looked at the evidences for these two attributes, pleasure and anger, in the book of Allah Azza wa Jal and likewise in the Sunnah. And where we finished in the previous lesson was in relation to those who negate these attributes from the Jahmiyyah and those who followed them, the Mu'tazila and the Kullabiyya and the Ash'ariyya and the Maturidiyya. They basically had a number of approaches towards this attribute. One way was that they said that Allah Azza wa Jal, these attributes are eternal, that Allah is angry with the one whom He knew would die upon disbelief, even though he was a believer in between. Right? So Allah is always angry with him, even whilst he was a believer in between, before he died as a disbeliever. And the other way around, that Allah is always pleased with the one whom He knew would die upon belief, even though he was a disbeliever, a mushrik in between, committing all the most evil, vile actions. In other words, Allah's anger and pleasure, and likewise other attributes as well, they are not tied to His will and choice, such that He becomes pleased after being displeased, and being displeased after being pleased. And so this clashes with what we see clearly in explicit verses in the Quran and explicit ahadith in the Sunnah. Now the reason why they denied these attributes which are tied to Allah's will become clear as we proceed through today's lesson. But in the previous lesson we established these basic points. We looked at the evidences for these attributes, that they are tied to His will and His power, and some of the groups that basically denied these attributes, which means in the way that they made this interpretation, this false interpretation, where they made them to be eternal, then this is really a denial of the attribute. So we'll continue. We looked at two mas'alas last time. So we move to the third issue. And so basically this now we need to look at some terminology. There's a terminology that was basically invented, and we are familiar with this terminology, as-sifat dhatiyya. As-sifat al-dhatiyya. This means attributes which are tied, which relate to Allah's essence. And as-sifat al-fi'liyya. As-sifat al-fi'liyya. Attributes which are tied to Allah's, which are basically actions which are tied to His will and choice. Another way you could say that is as-sifat al-ikhtiyariyya. As-sifat al-ikhtiyariyya, meaning chosen actions. Now really the first people to come out with this terminology were the likes of Ibn Kullab. Right? This terminology was not invented by the Salaf, because to the Salaf everything is the same. Whether we are speaking about Allah's essence, whether we are speaking about Allah's attributes, whether we are speaking about Allah's actions, we don't make any distinction. Why? Because the principle with respect to them all is one and the same. It's one principle, which is basically that whatever we find affirmed by Allah for Himself or by His Messenger for Allah, then we affirm that, irrespective of what it is, whether it is an attribute, whether it is an action, irrespective, because this was the uniform principle that the Salaf were acting upon. When these people came along, and obviously they brought an innovated approach that we will look at shortly, because of that innovated approach, they began to deny something. Some of them denied everything. Some of them denied some things and denied others. Some of them denied most things and denied some. So they differed amongst themselves. And within that differing, they began to bring these types of classifications. As-sifat al-dhatiyah, as-sifat al-fi'liyah. Right? To help explain why they affirm something and why they deny something else. Right? So these terms were actually arose out of these kinds of issues. The Salaf never brought these definitions. However, that does not mean that, obviously, because we find that the scholars over time, like you find in the writings of Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, you find like today in the writings of the scholars like Shaykh ibn Uthaymeen and others, that from the angle of understanding this topic, these terms are still used. They are still used. Right, from the angle of understanding these issues in a bit more detail. So we need to be clear about that the Salaf never invented these terms, the people of Bid'ah did. In and of themselves, there might not necessarily be anything wrong with these terms and definitions, as long as they are spoken of, within the context of the madhab of the Salaf, and they help a person to aid and understand some of these deeper technical issues. Otherwise, the general principle, if none of these sects had appeared and none of this deviation had appeared, the principle would have been the same. That whatever we find in the Quran, the Sunnah, we simply affirm it. No matter what it is, a name, an attribute, an action, it's all following one simple principle. But anyway, these terms, as-sifat al-dhatiyah, as-sifat al-fi'liyah, then as for the first, as-sifat al-dhatiyah, they are those attributes which are permanently with Allah Azza wa Jal. They are necessary and binding to the one who is described by them. And so, in other words, we mean by this that these attributes Allah is never devoid of. So for example, the attribute of wajh, which is the face of Allah Azza wa Jal, and this is something that Allah is always described with. And likewise, al-azma meaning greatness, and al-kibriya, again greatness, and al-jalal, which means loftiness, and an-nur, which means light. These are things which are permanent. Allah is always permanently described with. And this is what we mean by sifat dhatiyah. The second type of attributes, which are the sifat fi'liyah, are those which are in fact connected to His will and choice. They are not said of Allah Azza wa Jal permanently. So for example, we do not say Allah is always angry. Or rather, anger is something that is tied to Allah's will and His choice. And His will, His mashi'ah, His qudra, His ikhtiyar, His power, His will. So they are not permanently said of Allah Azza wa Jal, but they, Allah chooses to become angry or pleased, and so therefore we say that they are sifat fi'liyah. Sifat fi'liyah. Now, this second type itself is of two types as well, right? There can be like a combination of the first type and the second type, meaning those which are permanent and then at the same time they're also connected to choice as well. For example, we say that Allah Azza wa Jal is permanently described with speech, as one who speaks. Kalam is an eternal attribute. Allah has never been one devoid of speech, devoid of the attribute of speech. But when it comes to the actual speech, we see that it is tied to Allah's will. When He wills, He will speak. Right? So it's permanent on the one hand, but it's also related to choice as well. Right? So there are some attributes which are basically like this. For example, Allah is the creator, Al-Khaliq. Right? He is eternally the creator. He's always described as one who creates. But in the individual instances of Allah creating, they are by His choice and His will. Right? So there are certain attributes where they are eternal from one angle, and from the other angle they are tied to Allah's will and His choice. Whereas attributes like face and hands and eyes, which befit His majesty, they are permanent. They are sifat dhatiyah. They are permanent. They are never said to be tied to Allah's will. That's not possible. So as long as we understand this, and obviously the examples of each type, the examples of ghadab and rida are the examples which are tied to Allah's will and choice, and the example of kalam, speech, they are both sifat. That is both a sifa dhatiyah and likewise a sifa fi'liyah. Now, once this is clear, we now come on to look at why these people basically began to deny these attributes which are tied to His will and His power. Now, as you should know from previous lessons, we are speaking again here about the Ahlul Kalam, the people of Kalam, this whole group of people as a whole who delved into this topic and began to deny at least something from the names and attributes of Allah Azza wa Jal. We refer to them as the people of Kalam. And when we say the word Kalam, what we are really referring to is that these people, they came along and they tried to prove Allah's existence and prove Allah's names, for those who affirm names, and prove Allah's attributes using a method which is alien to the Quran, which is not from the Quran. They basically, really, their position was really this, that it is obligatory to know Allah by way of reason before you come to know Allah by way of revelation, right? In other words, you have to intellectually, rationally prove Allah's existence to convince yourself, and only then is your belief genuine, right? But if you went to the Quran and you saw in the Quran that Allah proves His existence and Allah establishes for Himself names and attributes, and you believed in that, you would simply be a blind follower. You would not have established Iman in which there is no doubt. This was the basic thinking, the basic idea. And really this approach is something that they took and they borrowed from the philosophers, because as you know that the philosophers, this is what they believe. They don't believe in a creator. They simply believe that, when we come to understand the creation, we have to first of all suspect and remove all of our knowledge and start with a clean slate. And then using pure reason, we will then proceed to build an accurate picture of what is around us. And this is what we call sound or scientific knowledge, right? But obviously this itself is flawed, because you always have to have assumptions. Anyone who does what they call science, anyone who engages in observing and seeing patterns and making inferences, right, and developing theories and hypotheses and theories, you cannot begin except by making assumptions, right? And so this method is always flawed. This whole apparatus of science, even when you read the famous philosophers of science who speak about the scientific method, you will see that basically it is impossible to engage in scientific research or scientific observations except that you always have some sort of ideology beforehand. You always have some sort of assumptions beforehand, right? So anyway, the point being that this is just science, whether we're speaking now or whether we're speaking thousands of years ago. But the general idea of these philosophers was basically, we have to first assume ignorance of everything and start with a clean slate, and then use pure reason to arrive at knowledge of everything. But they applied this in the worldly affairs, right? So basically, this was their apparatus of knowledge in the observable world. So what these people did, the people of Kalam, they basically took that approach and then they used it as it relates to Allah Azza wa Jal. Right? As it relates to Allah Azza wa Jal, His names and His attributes. So straight away from the very beginning, you can see that there's a problem here. And when they basically use this approach in trying to prove Allah's existence and speaking about His names and His attributes, then this approach itself, it basically, to remain consistent, it forced them to start denying what Allah affirmed for Himself from His names, His attributes and His actions. And then because they differed amongst each other, the Jahmiyyah, the Mu'tazila, the Kullabiyya, the Ash'ariyya, the Maturidiyya, then they began having differences amongst themselves. Some of them denied everything, some of them affirmed something, some of them, So these are the people that we refer to as Ahlul Kalam. And so basically, before we start out on the discussion of the detailed discussion, we should understand first of all that there are basically, we can put them into, the best way to do it would be to put them into 4 groups, right? So we'll start with the Jahmiyyah. So they came along and they denied everything. Allah cannot be given names, attributes, actions. All of this is impossible for Allah Azza wa Jal, because if we affirm them, then we have likened Him to the creation. Right? This is the Jahmiyyah, denied everything. Then the Mu'tazila, this is the second group, and they basically said, well, clearly we see in the Quran Allah has affirmed names, so we can't deny Allah has names, but Allah has no attributes. Right? So they said, yes, Allah is Ar-Rahim, Ar-Rahman, Al-Malik, Al-Quddus, As-Salam, Al-Mu'min, Al-Muhaymin, Al-Aziz, Al-Alim, and Al-Hakim, and so on and so forth. Right? So they affirmed just mere names, but they said there are no attributes. Mu'tazila. There are no attributes. Right? So this now is irrational, because you are saying that Allah Azza wa Jal, He is Al-Hakim, but He doesn't have wisdom. He's all-wise with no wisdom. How does that make sense? How does that make sense? Allah is Al-Kareem, the kind, generous, but He has no kindness and generosity. How does that make sense? It doesn't make any sense. Right? Really, they're upon the way of the Jahmiyyah, but to kind of deceive the people outwardly, they on the surface affirm the names, because you can't escape from affirming the names. Right? So this was the Mu'tazila. Even though strictly speaking, they did actually affirm a number of names and attributes, like 3 or 4 of them. But this became known from them afterwards that generally they deny the attributes in general. So this is a second group, right? So if we that's group number 1, group number 2, the Jahmiyyah, the Mu'tazila. Now these groups, between them, you can see that they deny the names and the attributes, and obviously they deny Allah's actions, right? They deny those actions which are tied to Allah's will, actions which are tied to His will, and they don't affirm any of this. So along came a third group, and they are the Kullabiyya, and they are named after Ibn Kullab. And Ibn Kullab, he used to debate with the Jahmiyyah and the Mu'tazila. He would engage in arguments with them. And in the course of his arguments with them, he obviously was exposed to this proof that they are using, this evidence that they are using, the evidence of reason by which they are trying to establish Allah's existence. So he became convinced that this proof, yes, this is a rational, genuine rational proof. Although to us, it is a false proof. Right? But he became convinced that this proof, basically, there's no other way to prove Allah's existence rationally except by way of this proof. And because he accepted that premise, the Mu'tazila and the Jahmiyyah were able to basically subdue him and overcome him in argument as it relates to the actions of Allah Azza wa Jal. Right? So they basically said to him, well, if Allah Azza wa Jal has actions which are tied to His will, it means that He is subject to change. At one moment He spoke, and another moment He didn't speak. One moment He became angry, the next moment, another moment He was pleased. This undergoing change is something that is a deficiency. And this is something that only applies to created bodies. How can you affirm these actions for Allah Azza wa Jal? It's impossible. If you affirm these actions for Allah Azza wa Jal, it means you have undermined the proof for His existence. Because now we can't prove that He exists. Because what's the difference between Him and between all the created things which undergo change and transformation? Right? Which means that they, so how, and then they began to use this word, and this word, they call it al-hawadith. Al-hawadith means events, right? Meaning that Allah is someone who undergoes events. Allah undergoes changes. He changes, right? Events take place in His essence. So how can you affirm this when this is likening Allah to His creation, and this then does not allow us to prove that Allah exists? So they began to say to him that you are affirming hawadith for Allah Azza wa Jal. So Ibn Kullab, he basically came out with the explanation that we looked at in the previous lesson, right? That Allah's anger, Allah's pleasure, and all those other attributes which are tied to His will and choice, they are eternal with Allah Azza wa Jal. Right? In other words, that they are not attributes tied to Allah's will and pleasure. It's just something that Allah, they are eternal like the other attributes, like Allah's life, like Allah's hearing, like Allah's seeing. Right? Now obviously this in turn now has an implication. How do we then explain that Allah becomes angry with people and becomes displeased with people? So what they did was, they associated it not to the individual actions performed by people, but rather to the end outcome of an individual, right? In other words, to the death of an individual, right? So Allah's pleasure now and Allah's anger is now tied to the death of an individual, what he died upon. It is no longer tied to the individual actions, right? So for example, on one day a person might be righteous, right? He might fulfill his obligations, leave all the prohibitions. Allah is pleased with him. Next day he might fall into a sin, a major sin. Allah is displeased with him. The next day he might, make tawbah and repent, make istighfar, give charity, make up for his sins, make dua to Allah, give some charity, or whatever else, read some Quran. Allah is pleased with him. The next day so now it's no longer tied to the actions of the servants, right? Rather now it is tied to what a person died upon. So now this allows them to say that these attributes are not tied to Allah's will and choice. Rather, Allah is eternally angry with the one whom He knew was going to die upon disbelief. And He is eternally pleased with the one whom He knew was going to die upon belief, even though in between in his life he was something else. So this allowed them to provide an answer to the Jahmiyyah and the Mu'tazila, and allowed them to affirm these attributes according to them. Even though to us this is a denial of the attribute. This is not affirming the attribute. Why? Because it clearly clashes with the Quran and the Sunnah, which clearly proves that these are attributes tied to Allah's will and His choice and His qudra, His power. So So these were the basic arguments that were taking place between the Jahmiyyah, the Mu'tazila, and Ibn Kullab. And what this shows to us, what it proves to us, is that when you debate and argue upon other than the foundations of the Quran, you are going to fall into misguidance. And so really, as we mentioned before, these types of debates that you see going on today as well, you see all of these people who are using, basically they are using the argument of the Jahmiyyah and the Mu'tazila and the Ash'ariyah. This kalam, cosmological argument is kind of basically based upon the kalam of the Jahmiyyah and the Mu'tazila. And you see people making the same types of mistakes. And we spoke about this in previous lessons in a bit more detail. So now this evidence that was used by the Jahmiyyah, what were they basically saying? Well, it goes something like this. They say that Jahm bin Safwan, and they basically said that when we look at everything around us, we see that everything around us has, attributes. These attributes undergo change, right? Something is cold and it becomes hot. Something is hot, it becomes cold. Something is short, it becomes long. Something is long, it becomes short. Something is dense, then it becomes, light. And something is light, it becomes dense, right? Everything is in a constant state of change all the time. And, these things do not choose to undergo these changes, right? These changes occur to these things. This proves that there must be someone or something which is bringing about these changes, which is bringing about these, events and these effects that are taking place within these created bodies. It's a sign that they are dependent upon something else, right? And so these things are needy, they are dependent, which proves that there must be one who is not needy, right? And so therefore, they say that all of the bodies, therefore, that we see, whether it's the sun, whether it's the moon, whether it's any object that we see from the observable created objects, all of these things, they have attributes, they undergo changes, they undergo events, they are constantly undergoing transformation, right? It means that they are dependent and needy upon one who must not be like that, which is Allah Azza wa Jal. And so they thought that by this method, they have affirmed that every body, by body we mean any created thing which has, tangible existence, that therefore all of these things must have one whom they are in need of, which is the Creator, and the Creator Himself must not be subject to any change or any events, right? Do you understand that, yeah? Right? Otherwise He would be just like all the other bodies and things that we see and observe, which undergo transformation. Now, with this line of reasoning, they then realized, well, we'll come to that in a minute, but basically this argument is false. We'll come to explain why it is false in a short while, right? This is basic reasoning. And it's not the way that we find in the Quran. Allah Azza wa Jal has affirmed His existence. We see that these kind of methods of affirming Allah's existence are philosophical, they are abstract, they involve things that the common person might not understand. They involve the use of definitions which are not agreed upon. And what happens is that something which would normally be very simple and straightforward, it becomes really long, deep, drawn out, subject to debate, and it doesn't really finish the matter in a simple, clear way. Right? Do you understand? This is different to what we find in the Quran. Everything in the Quran is the simplest, most powerful, most easy to understand form of evidence. Right? It's something that there's no wrangling, there's no ambiguity. It's simple, straightforward, and just absolutely powerful. Whereas when we look at, and this is actually something that you find generally about all of the sciences of the disbelievers and their philosophy, that basically it's just something that is so simple, it becomes so unnecessarily complicated and drawn out, right? And there's all sorts of definitions, and no one really knows what, each person's definition is different, and something that is very simple becomes just unnecessarily lengthy and detailed and complicated, right? So what we find in the Quran is very simple. There are numerous evidences for Allah's existence in the Quran. The first one is the famous ayah in Surah At-Tur, the famous passage, Am khuliqu min ghayri shay'in am humul khaliqun am khalaqu as-samawati wal ard bal la yuqinun. In this ayah Allah says, were they created by nothing, or are they themselves the creators, meaning of themselves, or did they create the heavens and the earth? They have no certainty. So basically in this passage there are only three, basically there are four possibilities altogether, right? Allah Azza wa Jalla is saying, were you created by nothing? Did nothing create you? Did you create yourself? Did you create the heavens and the earth? Right? Now here are three self-evident truths, meaning these are things that you don't need to do experiments to know that they are true, right? You were not created by nothing. You did not create yourself. Every man knows this, right? You did not create the heavens and the earth. Every man knows this, right? So the only option left available is that someone created you and the heavens and the earth. Now what is this thing? What is this being? Right? And so this, here we can at least establish this being, that, this is a creator. Right? So this is very simple because it basically brings together all the possibilities. There's no other possibility. Right? You can either say, basically it's either self-creation or it's someone creating. And self-creation is a logical impossibility. Right? But really, when you look at all the detailed complex sciences and the way they deceive you, if you basically reduce it down and put it in a nutshell, what is it you're trying to say? That's really what they're trying to say. Right? The universe created itself. Right? But the way they present it is in such a complex, detailed way that a person becomes baffled that they can't really say in a nutshell, what are you really trying to say? That's what they basically, they hide it. Right? So if you imagine a cone that is turned upside down and it goes like this, right? Right at the bottom is the pinpoint, the simple thing that everything rests upon, right? But as you move further out, it becomes wider and wider and broader. Then all of this becomes just complex. It becomes more complicated philosophically and the use of scientific language and whatever else. But when you come right down to the crux of it and you say, well, what is the real assumption that you're working to here? And the assumption is, well, actually nothing can create something, right? And so that's how it's really working. So anyway, this is one method of argument. Another method that we see in the Quran is that Allah Azza wa Jalla, He basically asks mankind about some of the things that they see around them. For example, Allah Azza wa Jalla, He says, نَحْنُ خَلَقَنَاكُمْ فَلَوْلَا تُصَدِّقُونَ أَفَرَأَيْتُمْ مَا تُمْنُونَ أَأَنْتُمْ تَخْلُقُونَهُ أَمْ نَحْنُ الْخَالِقُونَ. Allah Azza wa Jalla, He says, we created you. Why then will you not believe? Do you not see what you emit? Meaning the seminal fluid, the fluid. Did you create it or are we its creators? Right. So, now obviously here we know that the semen, the sperm in fact, contains basically the program of life. Right. So the question here is, did you create that or did we create it? And so this again is a rhetorical question. Man knows he did not create that. He knows he didn't create it. And he knows what it involves of the complex, the creation, the programming of everything, the embryo, everything, what it results. Right? That's one thing. Then, a little later in the same surah, Surah Al-Waqi'ah, Allah Azza wa Jal, He says, أَفَرَأَيْتُمْ مَا تَحْرُثُونَ. Do you not see that which you plant? Basically the seed. أَأَنْتُمْ تَزْرَعُونَهُ أَمْ نَحْنُ الزَّارِعُونَ. Are you the ones who planted it? أَأَنْتُمْ تَزْرَعُونَهُ أَمْ نَحْنُ الزَّارِعُونَ. Or are we the ones who basically planted it? I'm speaking here about the seed and the whole process of the seed being nourished by the soil, the water, the air, and the seed splitting and then growing. And again, this is programming. Again, the seed is programmed, right? You have different seeds, all nourished by the same nutrients and the same water and the same air, but leading to something completely different. This one produces these flowers and these fruits, and that one produces different flowers and different fruits, and that's, this is amazing. That one same seed acted upon by all different, the same elements, but within it is a programming that is different each time. Are you the ones who did that, or are we the ones who basically planted it, and so on and so forth? And man knows he did not do that. A man knows that is planted and programmed or whatever else. Then he continues a few verses later. أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ الْمَاءَ الَّذِي تَشْرَبُونَ أَأَنْتُمْ أَنزَلْتُمُوهُ مِنَ الْمُزْنِ أَمْ نَحْنُ الْمُنزِلِينَ. Do you not see the water that you drink? Are you the ones who made it descend from the clouds? Or are we the ones who made it to descend? Again, the water, same thing. And finally, afterwards, in a few verses later, أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ النَّارَ الَّتِي تُورُونَ أَأَنْتُمْ أَنْشَأْتُمْ شَجَرَتَهَا أَمْ نَحْنُ الْمُنْشِئُونَ. Do you not see the fire that you basically kindle and burn? Are you the ones who originated the tree which provides the branches for which to create the fire, generate the fire? Or are we the ones who originated it? Right? So again, an allusion to the trees and what comes out of it, of the fuel for the fire, and so on and so forth. Now obviously these verses here are pointing to a man to just reflect upon himself, his weakness, his inability, that everything around him is subjected for his use. This is something that is so obvious to everybody, that everything around you, the sun, the moon, the trees, the water, the seeds, right? Everything is subjected for you. This is obvious. No one can deny it except someone who is arrogant. And so this in itself is clear that this has been subjected for your use, and therefore there is one who subjected it for your use, and He is Allah Azza wa Jal, the Creator. And so when we look at these, even the issue of the semen or the sperm, something that is so lowly, yet within it is the secret to life. Something that we would look down upon and despise and consider to be lowly, right? Because it's something emitted. But within it is the secret to life. So man's origin is from something lowly. So when you reflect upon all this, you see how this lowly thing, within it is the secret to the life of man. So the point being here that from these verses, this brings us to a famous line of poetry in which the poet said, وَفِي كُلِّ شَيْءٍ لَهُ آيَةٌ تَدُلُّ عَلَىٰ أَنَّهُ الْوَاحِدُ. That in every single thing there is a sign which indicates that He is the one. So, these are just some of the approaches in the Quran, which are sound, rational, simple approaches. You can see the simplicity, the rationality, and no one can really deny the self-evident truths, right? Pay attention to this. In the Quran, we see ayat and bayyinat and barahin, right? Ayat meaning signs that you can see. The ayat of Allah Azza wa Jal. You see the sun, you see the moon, you see the ship sailing on the sea, you see the animals from which you take the milk. These are ayat. You see them. And they're lightning and everything else. Then there are bayyinat. Bayyinat. A bayyina. What is the bayyina? A bayyina is something that is just self-evident. It doesn't need you to be an intelligent. This is something that you just know. It is the truth. It is a bayyina. It is a self-evident truth. Right? So in the Quran, there are bayyinat, there are ayat. These are the simplest ways of basically arguing. So these people, they abandoned all of this and they took the approach of the philosophers, the disbelievers, right, who are the most misguided of people. They claim that they are objective. They claim that the power of reason, the rationale, that it's objective, that it's basically unbiased. And this is nonsense. This is nonsense. Because even today, when you look at the philosophy of science and the famous people, Thomas Kuhn, and there's other people who wrote, who are recognized to be the experts in this field, when they speak about science and the scientific method, and can it be unbiased, or is there always ideology involved? Even in the field of mathematics, there are discussions about this as well. So when you get down to the nitty gritty in these areas, you find that they are admitting that basically that even the scientific apparatus has to involve ideology before you even perform it. Right? That there have to be assumptions, untested assumptions, unproven assumptions, right, in building the hypotheses and the theories and whatever else, right? So, so these people, the Jahmiyyah, the Mu'tazila, they basically borrowed the approach of the philosophers in studying what they call the natural world. Then they took that approach and then they tried to speak about that which is unseen. Allah Azza wa Jal, His names, His attributes, right? And as a result of that, basically, what they did was that they basically, they allowed the philosophers and the atheists to attack weak arguments, because these are weak arguments, right? And this wrangling and debating went on for 3, 4, 5 centuries, right? Because they got entangled in these fruitless debates, right? They basically allowed these philosophers and atheists to view Islam as something that's, has very weak and poor arguments, right? And eventually these people themselves, when you go 3, 4 centuries later, they become utterly confused, like Al-Ghazali, Al-Razi, right, as is mentioned by some of them, right? They became really confused. Even Shahrastani, these are Ash'ari scholars, and they began, because this proof that they were using, if you follow it logically and rationally all the way through, it causes you to basically deny that Allah created the creation. Why is this? This is because, think about this. If there was no creation, and there was Allah Azza wa Jal, and then a creation came to be, with what did that creation come to be? What changed? Alright? To us it is simple. Allah willed to create. He performed an action. Right? That action is tied to His will. Now, they can't affirm this, because to them, this now is from the hawadith. This means now, an event has taken place in Allah's essence. Something created has taken place in Allah's essence. This is false. Because when you say, for example, when I say, Abdullah stood, Abdullah sat, Abdullah ate, what we are saying here is Abdullah performed an action. Is it correct for us to say Abdullah created the action of standing in himself? No. This is what they're trying to say. They're trying to say that when we say that Allah created, Allah was pleased, Allah was displeased, they are saying this means Allah created some event in Himself. This is batil. This is all philosophical babble and nonsense that they took from the philosophers. Right? It's not even known in the Arabic language. When you say, for example, Qama Zaydun, Zayd stood. This does not mean in the Arabic language that Zayd created the action of standing in himself. Rather, it means it's an action ascribed to Zayd. Qama Zaydun. Right? So, even in the asl of the Arabic language, this is nonsense, what they're basically trying to say. Right? So the point being that when they're involved in all of this nonsense, right, they couldn't really affirm that the creation was created by an action of Allah. because that would invalidate everything. So really, what is this proof proven then? You've proved that Allah exists according to you, but then you've disproven that He actually performed an act of creation. So He didn't create then, so who created then? Yeah, so you can see it's a mess. It's a mess. And when they fell into this mess, they were then forced to deny the attributes and the actions in the Quran and Sunnah. This is where ta'wil came in, right? They began to deny Allah can be seen, that Allah is above His throne, that Allah speaks, that Allah, chooses actions by His will and choice. Because all of this now clashes with this flawed proof that they are relying upon, right? So basically, this is the in essence the reason why they denied these attributes, and they said, well, if we affirm these attributes, basically it means that Allah we are not able now to prove Allah's existence anymore, right? Because they thought this is the only way you can prove Allah's existence, and this is false, because there are many ways you can prove Allah's existence using reason, but which is the reason of the Quran, which is simple, powerful, and so they basically claim that if we affirm these things, our proof is negated. We can't prove Allah Azza wa Jal, and if we can't prove Allah Azza wa Jal, it means Islam is false. So therefore, this proof has to be right. This proof has to be right, and you can see how all of this is misguidance, all of this is incorrect, and so the point being then. This brings us back then to the statement of Imam At-Tahawi, rahimahullahu ta'ala, and the reason why he said, Wallahu yaghdabu wa yarda la ka ahadin min al-wara. He is refuting all of these groups. So basically, some of these groups didn't exist in his time, because At-Tahawi was at the beginning of the 4th century, at the time when Al-Ash'ari, so remember we spoke about Ibn Kullab. Al-Ash'ari, he used to be a Mu'tazili for most of his life. Then in Baghdad or Basra, he went to some of the masajid and he saw these people, the Kullabiyah. They were sat there in the masajid and they were teaching this Kullabi doctrine, and he found it to be good. So he took the Kullabi doctrine, and this became the asl of the Ash'ari madhab. But then as he learned more and more, he then came into contact with the teachings of Imam Ahmad. He slowly began to change and he began to move towards the creed of Imam Ahmad. So his books, we see a transition in his various books, Al-Maqalat, Al-Ibana, and some of the others, where he's basically transitioning away from this Kullabi doctrine towards the doctrine of Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, which is the doctrine of the Salaf. So At-Tahawi, so the statement of At-Tahawi basically is a refutation of all of these groups, the people of Kalam, the Jahmiyyah, the Mu'tazila, the Kullabiyya, the Ash'ariyya, and the Maturidiyya. So what we'll do is we'll conclude our lesson there. We still have a little bit left to finish off our discussion of this. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll do that in the next lesson. So basically this explains the asl of the ilmul kalam that these people are upon, the Jahmiyyah, the Mu'tazila. Today they are really the Ash'aris and Maturidis. They are the people who are upon this belief, upon this approach. But what's happened is really that, see, this underlying philosophy that we've discussed here, you no longer find it in their books anymore, right? Because they've realized the difficulties in this approach and that it can be contradictory, right? So this is found in the old books, the books of Abu Mansur al-Baghdadi, al-Razi, al-Ghazali, these kind of people, al-Baqilani, these kind of people, yeah? But in the later books, you find that they won't actually mention this long-winded discussion, but they will outline their creed on the basis that it is correct. But you won't find the details in the more recent books. And that's why today most of the Ash'aris and Maturidis, they don't really understand what on earth is really going on, right? Because they don't know the asl of where all of this came from. What they are told, they're simply told, beware of these evil people out there. They liken Allah to a body, right? They claim that Allah has events in his essence. He has hawadith. He has a'rad in his, and this is what they're taught with, right? But they don't know what is the asl of all of this. So these Ash'aris and Maturidis today, they are basically brainwashed and poisoned with what they think to be Tawheed. It is not the Tawheed of the messengers, it is the Tawheed of the philosophers. That's what it is, right? But then when it's brought into Islam, they just label it as Kalam and Ilmul Kalam and made it look good. But it's really just philosophy, that's all it is. So here at Tahaawiyyah, this statement in At-Tahaawiyyah's creed actually is one of the 2 or 3 places which is a clear, explicit refutation of the Ash'aris and Maturidis, right? It undermines their entire creed, right? And that's why you see them, they kind of doctor the way they translate this basic statement, right? They turn it away from being a verb, Wallahu yaghdabu, which is a verb, and they turn it into a noun. Allah's anger, Allah's pleasure. Like this is what that Hamza Yusuf did in his translation, right? Because they want to move the element of the action, the fi'l from it. So anyway, we'll conclude with that there, and we will finish this off in the next lesson, inshallah ta'ala. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.